On the 12th of August, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Gutka stepped off a Higgins boat onto the coast of Guadalcanal. He brought 24 Marines with him. A captured Japanese naval warrant officer loosened up with alcohol during interrogation had told them a group of Japanese soldiers near the Matanico River were demoralized and ready to surrender. A white flag had been spotted in the jungle west of the Marine perimeter. Gutka was the 1st Marine Division's intelligence officer. He believed it. He took a Japanese language specialist, a regimental surgeon, and a combat patrol to bring them in. They landed near Point Cruz after dark. Gutka was killed by the first burst of gunfire. There was no surrender. There had never been any intention to surrender. The white cloth was bait and 22 of those 25 men were dead before sunrise. Platoon Sergeant Frank F. was one of 3 survivors. He watched Japanese soldiers swarm the beach in the dark, firing into the bodies of the dead and the wounded, mutilating them. He killed one of them, then slipped into the ocean and swam for miles through shark-infested water back to American lines. No bodies were ever recovered. Then 9 days later, the lesson was carved even deeper. On the sandbar at Alligator Creek, Colonel Kanao Ichiki led 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment in a frontal night assault against the 1st Marine Division. Marine machine gunners tore them apart. Private Johnny Rivers was killed on his gun. Corporal Lee Diamond took over. Private Al Schmid kept firing after a grenade blinded him. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 800 Japanese lay dead on the sand. The battle was over. And then the killing started again. Marines walked among the bodies. Wounded Japanese soldiers sat up and opened fire. Others pulled grenade pins. A Japanese sergeant lunged at 3 officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, and tried to shoot them before he was put down. Marines who had survived the entire battle were killed by men they thought were corpses. Major General Alexander Vandergrift sat down and wrote a letter to the Marine Corps Commandant, Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb. The words in that letter would reshape the way Americans fought for the next 3 years. These people refused to surrender. The wounded will wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade. Then he wrote the sentence that became doctrine. You can readily see the answer to this. The answer was simple, and it was terrible. That answer had been written 11 months before the Gutka Patrol in a pocket-sized booklet every Japanese soldier carried into battle. On the 8th of January, 1941, War Minister Hideki Tojo issued Army Order No. 1, the Senken, instructions for the battlefield. Its central commandment was absolute. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. A Japanese soldier who surrendered was erased. His name was struck from village registries. His family faced public disgrace. He became a non-person. But the Senken went further than prohibition. A 1940 modification to the Imperial Japanese Army's Field Service Regulations had already removed Geneva Convention protections for the wounded and replaced them with a single new requirement. The wounded were not to fall into enemy hands. In practice, this meant Japanese military doctors killed soldiers too badly injured to evacuate. Officers handed out grenades to men who could no longer walk. And once a dying soldier had a grenade in his fist and an American approaching, taking that American with him was one small additional step. One of his commanders in many documented cases explicitly encouraged. The late war Japanese term for this was gwai, shattered jewel. Unit annihilation reframed not as defeat, but as honor preserved through destruction. This was not desperation improvised in a foxhole. It was institutional, doctrinal, and expected. By November of 1943, the tactic had spread across the entire Pacific theater. On the tiny coral island of Bashio at Tarawa Atoll, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted a garrison of approximately 4,500 Japanese troops, including elite Imperial Marines of the Special Naval Landing Force. The battle lasted 76 hours. More than 1,000 Marines were killed. Over 2,300 were wounded. Of the entire Japanese garrison, 17 men surrendered. 17 out of 4,500. The rest fought until they were dead, including final bonsai charges on the night of the 22nd of November. Among the Japanese casualties were soldiers who had feigned wounds or played dead, lying still until Marines stepped close enough to kill with a concealed grenade. Tarawa confirmed what Guadalcanal had already demonstrated. The fake surrender was not an anomaly. It was standard defensive doctrine, and the tactic did not remain static. It escalated. 7 months later on the island of Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito ordered the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War on the 7th of July, 1944. 4,311 Japanese soldiers threw themselves against Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien's 105th Infantry Regiment in a single night. But the banzai charge was not the worst of Saipan. At the sea cliffs of Marpi Point on the island's northern edge, Japanese propaganda had told civilians that Americans would torture, rape, and devour them. General Saito ordered civilians to die rather than be captured. Marines stood at the cliff edge and watched families throw their children into the ocean, then jump after them. A Time magazine correspondent on the scene described a group of 100 Japanese civilians who bowed to the Marines watching from above, stripped and bathed in the sea, dressed in clean clothes, spread a Japanese flag on a flat rock, and began pulling grenade pins one by one. A Japanese sniper shot those who hesitated to jump. Between 800 and 1,000 civilians died at Marpi Point, and on the slopes below among the caves and the bodies, the old pattern held. Japanese soldiers and armed civilians faked death before detonating concealed grenades on approaching Americans. In one documented incident, 2 women walked out of a cave naked and beckoned to an American patrol. The soldiers were veterans. They had seen this before. They opened fire. Both women fell dead with grenades hidden beneath their arms. Nobody was paying attention to a 20-year-old Mortman from Mobile, Alabama during the invasion of Palau in September 1944. His name was Eugene Sledge. K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines went on to Palau with 235 men. 85 came back without injury. Sledge kept notes in the margins of a pocket New Testament he carried through the fighting. He later published those notes. His testimony is the most unflinching enlisted Marine account in print. Any cave we attacked was covered by heavy __ fire from other mutually supporting positions, and all were interconnected within the ridges. The Jabs fought like demons and shot our stretcher teams, the corpsmen, and the wounded. We hated them with a passion known to few antagonists. Then the passage that defined the moral reality of the Pacific War. We never took prisoners. Even when some few tried to give up, they often tried to throw a grenade at us. After taking a position, we routinely shot both the dead and wounded enemy troops in the head to make sure they were dead. Sledge rejected the idea that this was racism. Some writers blame it on racism, he wrote. I don't believe that the code of Bushido by which the Japs fought fostered brutality. That was his view. The documented trade in Japanese ears, teeth, and skulls told a more complicated story. A Life magazine photograph from May 1944 showed a young woman in Phoenix, Arizona, posing with a Japanese skull her Navy boyfriend had mailed to her. The Army Judge Advocate General called these acts blatant violations of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Of the 11,000 Japanese soldiers on Palau, 202 were taken prisoner across the entire campaign. Only 19 of those were actually Japanese soldiers. The remaining 183 were Korean and Okinawan laborers who had never held a rifle. 19 Japanese combatants out of 11,000. Now, here is the detail that still does not make sense to anyone with a conscience. On Awoima in February of 1945, the Japanese specifically targeted the men whose only job was to save lives. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi had tunneled 11 miles of interconnected passages beneath the volcanic rock. He banned banzai charges. His men fought as guerrillas, appearing from concealed positions, killing and disappearing underground. And they learned to call for help in English. Japanese soldiers screamed, "Corpsmen," from hidden positions to lure Navy medical personnel into kill zones. The men who carried medical kits instead of rifles became primary targets. Navy corpsmen ripped the Red Cross brass off their arms. They tore away the Geneva Convention insignia that was supposed to protect them. They started carrying M1911 pistols alongside their bandages and morphine curettes. Pharmacist's mate First Class John Harlan Willis was treating a wounded Marine in a trench when Japanese grenades began landing around him. Willis picked up the first grenade and threw it back. Then a second, a third. He threw back 8 Japanese grenades while keeping his patient alive. The 9th one killed him. Posthumous Medal of Honor. Private Jacqueline Lucas had stowed away aboard a troop ship at 17 because the Corps would not let him deploy. On the 20th of February, his second day on Uoma, 2 Japanese grenades rolled into his trench. Lucas threw himself on top of both. One detonated. 250 pieces of shrapnel tore through his body. He survived. He was 17 years old. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders on Uoma, 216 survived the battle as prisoners. Most were unconscious or physically unable to resist when they were captured. Navy Corpsman John Bradley was one of the men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi. He almost never spoke about for the rest of his life. He told his son James a single story about his friend, Marine Ralph Iggy Ignatovsky. We were pinned down in one area. Someone elsewhere fell injured and I ran to help out, and when I came back, my buddy was gone. A few days later, someone yelled that they'd found his body. They called me over because I was a corpsman. The Japanese had pulled him underground and tortured him, his fingernails, his tongue. It was absolutely terrible. Bradley never told the story again. The American response was both informal and official. Informally, from 1942 onward, the standing procedure was clear. Shoot or bayonet everybody after taking a position. By PLU in Okinawa, this was universal practice. Officially, the War Department published Technical Manual TME 3480, Handbook on Japanese Military Forces, a 401-page intelligence document that noted the Japanese soldiers' determination to fight to the last or commit suicide rather than be taken prisoner. And officially, senior commanders tried everything to break the cycle. One American division offered a case of beer or a bottle of whiskey for each Japanese prisoner brought in alive. In the Southwest Pacific, the bounty was raised to 3 days leave and some ice cream. MacArthur's 41st Infantry Division earned the nickname the Butchers from Tokyo Rose. The men reportedly considered it a compliment. You could not bribe Marines into trusting a man with his hands up. Not after Guadalcanal, not after Tarawa, not after Peleliu, not after Uoma. If you found this worth your time, subscribe. I cover the forgotten tactics and untold survival stories of World War II every week. By the spring of 1945, the war had reached Okinawa. And for the first time, something shifted. A formal psychological warfare program authorized in May of 1944 had been retraining frontline troops on the intelligence value of prisoners and the need to accept genuine surrenders. But the real breakthrough was not training. It was a piece of paper. The Psychological Warfare Branch under Brigadier General Bonner Fellers had discovered a critical problem. The Japanese words for surrender, kozen and kafuku, carried a shame so absolute that no leaflet containing them would ever work. A Japanese soldier would die before reading a paper that asked him to surrender. So they built a new phrase, I cease resistance. The leaflets dropped on Okinawa instructed Japanese soldiers to throw away their weapons and helmets, striped to the waist, place the leaflet or something white on a stick, and walk slowly toward American lines. Every detail was engineered. A man stripped to the waist cannot hide a grenade. A man holding a stick above his head cannot pull a pin. The procedure solved the exact problem that had made the Pacific War surrenders lethal for 3 years. It worked. Not for all of them. Not even for most. Japanese soldiers in the caves of Okinawa still shot stretcher teams. Civilians who had been issued 2 grenades by the Imperial Army, one for the enemy and one for themselves, still killed their own children underground. Private First Class John Quinn Jr. of the 29th Marines and Private John Hartman were killed inside a cave in the town of Itaman on the 29th of June, 1945, one of the last cave ambush deaths of the war. Their remains were not located until a Japanese nonprofit excavated the site in 2022. But 11,250 Japanese prisoners were taken on Okinawa. The surrender rate climbed from under 1% to roughly 11%. For the first time in the Pacific War, a credible path to capture existed, and enough men took it to prove the cycle could be broken. Eugene Sledge went home to Mobile, Alabama. He earned a doctorate in biology. He taught at the University of Montevallo. He could no longer hunt birds without weeping. He wrote with the old breed at his wife's insistence decades after the fighting ended. It sits today on the Marine Corps Common Professional Reading List. William Manchester, a sergeant in the 29th Marines, was wounded on Okinawa. 23 years after the war, the nightmare started. He traveled back to every Pacific battlefield to confront what he could not forget. John Bradley, the corpsman from Suribachi, went quiet. He carried Iggy's death and everything he saw inside those tunnels for 50 years. He died in 1994 without ever telling the full story. These men were not born killers. They were young Americans trained to save the wounded and respect the laws of war. Then they were sent to fight in a theater where the wounded were weapons and the rules did not apply. On the 25th of July, 1945, a Marine Corps photographer captured a single image on Okinawa. A United States Marine stands in the open, one arm raised, signaling his squad to hold fire. In front of him, a wounded Japanese soldier emerges from a cave with his hands up, trying to surrender. The official caption reads, "Earlier in the war, Japanese who surrendered amounted to 1% of the total enemy troops killed or captured. On Okinawa, the percentage of prisoners in the total amounted to 11%. That photograph was taken 6 days before the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It shows a Marine choosing trust over 3 years of betrayal. After Gurkha, after Tenaru, after Tarawa and Plu and Uema, and every grenade pulled by every man pretending to be dead. It is the most dangerous thing a Marine could do in the Pacific, and it is the most